Welcome. My name's John Broom. I'm the chair of the Contracts and Procurement SIG. What are we going to do today? Well, it's just a little bit of scene setting and a very brief introduction to our speaker, and then we will crack on with the main event. A little bit of scene setting. Martin approached to do this webinar, and we discussed it at our committee meeting, and I have to say we were very divided on it. And the reason was that there was a concern amongst the more conservative, should we say more legalistic based as well, people, that we would inadvertently be encouraging people to do stuff which is illegal. So what we decided to do was go back to Martin and have a discussion with it and raise our concerns, and fair play to Martin. Martin said, you're absolutely right to have those concerns. They need to be discussed. People need to be aware of it so that they can either decide not to participate or go forwards with this, or if they are, they're going forwards with it with their eyes wide open. So with that, I'm going to just very briefly introduce Martin. So Martin is the founder of the London and Bristol Data Analytics Meetups, which is a community of over 2,200 people in the interest in levering the plume of data that is emitted from projects. A fellow of the APM, a registered project professional and chartered engineer, and CEO of and founder of Projecting Success, a consultancy which specialises in data analytics.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate that. Thanks for the opportunity today as well. In terms of data analytics and bids, I think it's exciting times actually. I think there's going to be a big transformation coming across the industry in data analytics, working on projects, and that's something that I've been focusing on for the past 2 or 3 years now. So I'd just like to whiz you through a bit of my background and explain a bit of context. The first slide is about my sort of background. So it's been mentioned already, I'm a chartered project professional and a chartered engineer. I've worked in loads of different sectors. More recently, I've been working in oil and gas and construction, but I've worked in aerospace, defence, nuclear, and big ICT projects as well. I've been a project manager, which I led a $1 billion job. I've also been a portfolio lead, running a PMO on a multi-billion job as well. So I've had quite a lot of experience working a supply side and buyer side, and I've been into various jobs as well. So I've seen this from both angles. And for me, I think there's a great opportunity now to start to transform the way we start to bid projects in the future, and we start to analyse those, and the way that we start to engage as suppliers in that process. And it's potentially transformational. So let me give you some sort of overview in terms of what project data analytics is all about, first of all. So there's some terminology that's floating around. So artificial intelligence is the parent term. It sits right at the top. Underneath that is machine learning. And what's really important about machine learning is about learning from experience. So people talk about lessons learned, and lessons learned is something that's been going on for 40, 50 years, and it's not that effective. If we use slightly different language, which does the same thing, so instead of lessons learned, we start to learn from experience, we can then start to use all of these advanced techniques. And these advanced techniques then means that we can start to leverage all of that experience from bids, from project delivery, from risks, etc., and start to join all of that together and get some insights, which might include predictive insights as well. In terms of deep learning, it sits underneath machine learning, and it's a neural network which is automatically created by the computer, and it starts to look at those features across that network which differentiate and which starts to give some predictive capabilities. So why is this taking off at the moment? So it's taking off for various reasons, and a big one is data. There's just so much data out there at the moment, and there's a good quote there in terms of IBM's quote, which is in 2016, 90% of the world's data, in terms of all data ever created, had been created in the previous 2 years, and that's still continuing to grow now. We've also got cloud, and that is cloud storage and cloud compute. We also put the algorithms in the cloud as well, and we can access those through things like Python. So a lot of those algorithms are actually free, and they've been created through PhDs, and you can also go and download them from various facilities such as IBM Watson, you can do it through TensorFlow and Amazon Web Services, etc. So that's a quick overview about what data analytics is all about. So in terms of the use cases, so in project management, it's worth just whizzing through some of these use cases. So what we've got in terms of risk management, we tend to look at risk as a once-through process, and risk management is used for project delivery. After project delivery, all of those risks tend to get thrown away or archived, and we don't use them again. If we start to join them together, we start to look at the risk life cycle and see which of those risks turned into issues, and then what lessons we can take from that, etc. That's when it starts to give you some predictive capabilities. If you think about stakeholder management, we look at things at the moment with things like power versus influence grids, and instead, if we look at that as a connected graph, then we can start to get a lot more insights from the data. And that graph there on the right hand side is something which came out of the Game of Thrones, and somebody took a script and they read the script through a computer, and they look at those relationships between key characters and the power of those relationships in terms of the number of communications, and start to map it out. And you can press a play button on that, and you can see the evolution of that stakeholder grid over time. So the thing on the left-hand side is what we're using at the moment, which is a bit 1980s, 1990s. And the thing on the right-hand side is where we could start to move to if we start to use advanced data analytics. And I think that's really exciting. If we also look at scheduling, so we can take the corpus of all schedules ever produced in theory, and some organizations start to do this. We can extract some logic in terms of work breakdown structure. We can look through it in terms of deep learning and find out which of those parts of the schedule are most subjective to a variance. We can link it with weather models and things like that. We can start to predict then what the outturn of those projects are going to be, and that's not based around a simple things like Monte Carlo simulation. We can now start to do it much more effectively. So that's a use case in terms of project management, and now I'd like to drill down into the use case associated with bid analytics. So this presentation, I would warn you, it's a bit marmitey. And there's some people who think that this is not what we should be doing. We should leave bids to market forces and not start to analyze the detail. Whereas I believe, because I'm an advocate of project data analytics, is that once you start to get the insights out of this, you can start to really shape things and start to make a lot more intelligent decisions on working with the supply base, and as a bidder, also bidding into it. So we can then start to really shape the future of procurement. So for me, it's all down to perspectives, and there's some people who's trying to stop this, and I can understand why, and there's some people who's actively trying to push it forward. And I'd say, try not to look at it through your own perspective. Try and take a step back and think of it in terms of the macro picture and the macroeconomics of it. And for me, it's not a case of should we do it, because we can do it already, and I'll start to demonstrate some of that. And people will start to apply this because we're working with people at the moment, and we see that this is all possible today. I think the question for this community is, what do we do to shape it and to influence it? So in terms of those use cases, we've got various things which are operating in tension. So in terms of public sector, they're looking at using this to encourage and maximize competition, scenario modeling, improving quality of bids, etc. But they're also concerned about preventing precedent. So if we start to do this somewhere, then once it's been set, then they're worried that it's going to be set across various other bids in the future. They're also concerned that people will game it. There'll be reputational damage if we find from this analytics that some decisions have been made which shouldn't have been made. And there'll be various appeals because we can now start to pull the outliers out of it. And a third thing about tension is the link back to the industrial strategy. So there's an industrial strategy which is about our artificial intelligence sector deal, and it's trying to push this sort of technology, and it's trying to say, if we go down an artificial intelligence future, we can now start to drive a lot of exports, and we become really effective as a country. So we've got all those things are working in tension. And then we've got even more tension, which is with the private sector. So if we start to think about this, we can start to scan these opportunities in real time, across all these various procurement portals, and we can download the text from them, and we can put some text analytics over the top of them and start to work out, based upon all the bids that's been bid before and which ones are being won, which ones are being lost, etc., where you've got the greatest probability of win. So you can start to rack and stack them in real time, just from sort of web scraping data. And that means then you can start to work your pipeline up, and it's not a personal bias influence, it's from the data of performance of what's gone before. And I'm not saying that should be the answer, I'm saying that should influence your decision making. It can start to inform what you bid and you don't bid. It starts to inform scoring mechanisms as well. So you can go back to the public sector, and you could say to the public sector, for instance, is that you've got these bid scores in here. Because you're weighting X parameter really, really highly, it means you've only got one really strong competitor, and that means you've got a dominant competitor, and they're going to just clean up on the market and they can name their own price. If we start to change those scoring mechanisms, it can start to level off the playing field and increase competition. So it could identify areas for improvement, shape future strategy in terms of a market engagement strategy. You can also look at client loyalty as well. I think that's quite interesting. So which clients tend to work with the same suppliers all the time, and which ones just go for the most economically advantageous tender. Collaboration as well, so you can work out which partners are the best for you. You can identify bids which have got an outlier, so where you think the sort of bid scorings worked against you. I think that's quite interesting as well. And scenario modeling, so you can start to say, if we change this part of the bid, then what's the impact? And if we pull this through from another bid, then what's the impact? So all of those use cases are working in tension, and I accept, depending upon where you're sat, you've probably got a different perspective on it. So in terms of this presentation today, I'm going to be talking about construction because I've got a lot of data from construction, and it's quite easy to talk about. We can do it in other sectors as well, but I think this is a good use case just to get the conversation flowing. So in terms of construction, let's just look at the backdrop and the economics of construction. So there's all these problems with Carillion and Interserve, etc. And a big part of Carillion, which was pulled out in the Parliament report, is about lowballing bids, underbidding, etc. And we can now start to detect some of that. So we can look at that in the overall data set. That's very difficult to do unless you're drilling into the data. What we can also do is to look at the contractors in the industry, and the top 10, so this is from building.co.uk from July last year, is the top 10 contractors have got a margin of 0.5%. So if we're looking at that, we need to be working with the construction sector is to make it profitable so we don't get more failures, because when we get failures, government's got to bail them out, people lose their pensions, and there's lots of people out of work. So the macroeconomics of that are really significant. So we need to be working with the industry to make it commercially viable, so we've got some healthy competition, etc. So we need to think differently about this problem. And there's another slide there. So that was very recently. So there's 13,000 construction firms in significant financial distress. So when we're looking at this through a public sector lens, we'll think, right, let's run competitions. We want the most competitors involved. Those competitors then go and write a bid. That bid costs them £200,000 to write the bid. If you've got a lot of people bidding it and they've got no chance of winning it, you're going to be contributing to those 13,000 firms which are suffering financial distress. So we need to think about the macroeconomics of it. So what we did is we pulled a load of data out. So we got it from TED data, contract finder data, some subscription services. We got 70,000 contracts, and some of those contracts aren't construction contracts, some of them are, so we then filtered them. What we also did is we put in a lot of freedom of information requests, and for me that's a unsustainable approach. I think some of this data should be in the public domain, so we don't need to keep asking for it, and I'll explain why. So in terms of these FOI requests, I'd just like to build this picture up for you. So we've been saying, for instance, could you share the bid scores on a certain competition? And this is the scores. So if I sit a maths test, I'm saying I want to know, what my score was in long division, multiplication, adding up and taking away. I'm not asking for the answers to the questions because that is commercially sensitive. I just want to know what the scores were. So what we can find out, and this is already available at the moment, and there's loads of precedent on it, so I can know who won a competition. And that's in the public domain, that tends to be in TED. If you want to know who competed, then that's available. What the winner's score was versus the rest of the scores, and that's available, so you can start to sort of mine some of that data. The composition of the winning scores, we've been getting that information from the Freedom of Information requests, largely without context. There's some people who said that they don't want to share that data, and we've gone back and appealed that, and we've won most of those appeals. The composition of all scores as well, so not just the winning scores, but all scores will be winning that. And the only one that we've not won is who scored what. So we know that the winning score would score 6 in maths, 10 in subtraction, and 9 in multiplication. What we don't know is what the rest of those organisations scored. And if we don't know what the rest of the organisations scored, we can't do a relative comparison from bid to bid. We can't start to understand trends. So I've taken this to the Information Commissioner's Office, and they've ruled in my favour against the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office have now appealed to the Tribunal Service. The ICO ruled against me on another one of the cases were identical. It was looked at by a different case officer. So I've appealed that one to the Tribunal Service. So this is now going through, and very timely. I got this from the postman knocking on the door this morning, which is the case packs. So this is now going to Tribunal. I've asked for a hearing because I think this is really, really important that we start to test what goes in the public domain with these things, because I think this is really important. And let me explain why it's important and what the process is. So with bid data, in terms of worked example, we take all of this data from TED and various other places, and we clean it. And there's lots of things in there, lots of typos, lots of mistakes in there. We try and pull those out. We then associate the data. So we say these things are talking about the same bid. So we got it from different data sources, and we aggregate it and all link it together. We then apply text analytics and segmentation to it, so we can say, for instance, it's talking about a school, it's talking about a hospital, there's a certain client. So if it's Highways England, we tend to know that it's about roads. If it's talking about roundabouts, then we know it's a certain sort of construction project. And then we can apply machine learning and say, based upon all that information, all the bid scores, who's won, the TED data, etc., we can now start to forecast who's won a bid, etc. So we pull out of all that data these things called features, and those are the things that you use as a human being normally to form a view on what the factors are which are going to differentiate a bid. And when a machine does it, it's pulling out thousands of those features, and that might be things like, is it roundabout, is it a school, is it a certain location, what's the value of the bid as well, because the small bids tend to go to these sort of organisations, and the bids above 100 million go to these sort of organisations. So it picks up all of those parameters and starts to put weightings on them and says, in these situations, these features are more influential than these other features. So we can then start to find out who's likely to bid, who's going to win, and do they win by a nose, or they're going to win by a furlong, who's in the top 3, the top 5, and what the probabilities of each is, success rates of each of those suppliers based upon the number of bids they put in, what the client loyalty is, and variance in performance across various clients. So you might find there's some bias in certain clients against certain suppliers, or it might be a positive sort of bias which works in the favour in some suppliers. So we can start to drill into that, and it's all in that data set. So this is when it starts to get really, really cool. So we can predict bid outcomes to an average accuracy of 30%. And you think, well, that 30%, that's a 1 in 3 chance of getting it right. Now that's based upon the overall data set. So if you've only got a few data points, it means that this data analytics is not that good. It doesn't perform. That's just data analytics for you. It's just having a spread of data. And it's down to the quality of the data. And with some of these at the moment, we've not got the bid feedback scores. We've got some bid feedback scores, but not that many in the overall 10,000 contracts from the construction industry. So once we start to plug that in, then these performance levels will really start to shoot up. So in Network Rail, for instance, we've been forecasting the accuracy of network rail bids to 50%. So who's going to win a bid? We've been getting it right 50% of the time. If we look at North Tyneside, for instance, because there's a framework there, they've got 4 contractors in it, and there's been 23 contracts awarded. We've got that right 21% of the time. And these algorithms need to be refined all the time, and we've been working it through in terms of a minimum viable product. So this is our first go at this proof of principle, just to see if it's possible to stimulate this sort of debate. And you'll see there's a lot of variance there from authority to authority. And we're now starting to understand each of the parameters that start to influence that. And I think it's a really fascinating science. So what's the sort of thing that we get out of it? So what we can start to find out is the 5 most likely contractors for a certain opportunity. And in that, you want to understand, are those 5 contractors got an equal chance, or has one got a dominant chance? So you'll see there with BAM Construction, for instance, they've got an overriding probability of winning that certain bid. And if you were Balfour Beatty, then your chance of winning it will be 2%. And that's going to affect your bid, no bid decision. There's loads of other sort of analytics which we can start to drill into. So in terms of these sectors as well, you can start to work out which sector you're performing best in. You can look at supplier churn. So do certain clients keep on using the same suppliers all the time, and joint ventures. So which joint venture partner tends to perform the most and the best, etc. We can then get into the bid scores. So this is where it starts to get really interesting, and this is where we start to focus some of our attention, and this is where this tribunal is going as well. So we've raised FOI requests against 42 frameworks and about 200 underlying contracts, and we've got a lot of scores from that. So we can then start to do all this analysis about where your competitors start to outperform you, KPI analysis in terms of a greater spread of scores compared to average. So what's the overall variance? And we can start to look for certain question types, because we've got a taxonomy of the certain question types, where you fit on the overall distribution, you top quartile, bottom quartile, etc. And if there's a big distribution, it means that some of your suppliers are probably bidding and they've not got that much sort of probability of winning. And I think that in terms of clients, I think you've got a responsibility to help those suppliers to improve. And I think some of this starts to feed back. And you'll see from this scatter plot here, in terms of smaller organizations, they've got a sort of lower average score overall. So that's the weighted score against the standard deviation of the weighted scores. And the larger organizations tend to be clustering around the bigger scores and more consistent scores as well. So if we go to the next slide, this really starts to explain it as well. So the big companies which have got the more consistent scores are a lot more successful, and the companies who are smaller have got a lot more variation in their scores because they're not that consistent, because they've not got this off to a T yet. They've probably not got full-time bid teams, etc. And they're spending a lot of money on bids and they're not winning them. So we need to look into that. What we can also do is we can look at, from framework to framework, what the consistency in those bid scores are. So if you look at Sir Robert McAlpine there, and we've taken a sample of those 2 frameworks, their scores are pretty much identical from bid to bid. If we take Baumer Construction, in one case, they've got 61% of their overall score on one framework and 40% on other framework, and it's a very, very similar framework. And you can argue, so what's the difference in those 2 organizations, in those 2 clients? Why is it scored so differently? And then taking Kier there as a prime example, in one case their score is probably almost doubled. So the black one at the top for your build is almost double the one at the bottom, which is for the schools framework. And if they're bidding things, and we can start to drill into the underpinning detail of those scores, we can now start to say, why are we getting almost 50% of the score in one framework versus another framework, and we can then start to drill into it. What we can also do is start to do some box and whisker plots. So just to explain what these are about quartiles basically. So you can look at for a specific frameworks, and we've taken a sample of the frameworks here. You can start to look at the variance in scores across frameworks. So if we look at a BIM, for instance, so building information modeling, we'll see that there's a clustering of those scores, and it's quite a small variation. If we take things like health and safety and risk management, for instance, then from framework to framework, this is the average scores tend to be very, very different. And the minimum score there is 40%, the maximum score is 75%. So that's worth drilling into and to understand a bit further. So that's at an aggregate level, looking at each of those frameworks and working out at a framework level, what is the composition of those scores on average. If we then start to drill down and we look at a random company, and we've picked it out as Morgan Sindall, you'll see there is that some of those scores have got a large variance. So the one there on business resilience and continuity, there's a variance which goes from 50% to 92% across 3 frameworks. And that for me is really surprising, because if I'm writing a bid, that content of a bid is probably going to be quite similar. So why does it vary by 42%? That needs looking into, and I can drill deeper into that. And I pulled some other ones out as well. So health and safety, it tends to be a very similar proposal from bid to bid on health and safety. Yeah, that's varying by 30% in the scores. Why is that? We need to drill into that and start to understand it. And we can do this against each of these line items one by one, and we can start to understand why we've got the variance. So that's from a supplier perspective, and from a client perspective, we can start to say, why are we getting this variance in our supply base? What do we need to be doing so we can lift up the capability? Because what we actually want is the best possible bid, the most competitive bid. What can we do to help them and to improve all of these bids in the future? So in terms of doing this, what we're trying to do is to get some consistency between these frameworks as well, because if you bid in one, it's a bit of a lottery. If you bid in the second one and you're getting 50% of the score of the first one for no transparent and visible reason, it starts to frustrate you. We can even work with suppliers as well, because we need to close the gap from this front runner. If somebody's really dominant in the market, we can bring it in, and we can try and flatten out the competition. What we also might want to do is start to drive a more collegiate behavior. Instead of doing everything in out and out meet competitions, we might say, let's work towards more collaborative frameworks and manage some of this differently. I think there's also a case as well, if there's various frameworks and up to 60 construction frameworks, I think something like that, do we want to start to mark some of these things which have got commonality from bid to bid, like health and safety and BIM and these other things? Do we want to mark them centrally by somebody like Cabinet Office, so we get consistency of scoring across all of those bids? I think that's a question and a bit of challenge where we need to be asking some detailed questions with them. And I keep saying as well, this is about the macro lens. It's not about individuals. It's not about departments. It's not about your reputational damage. We need to look at the overall picture. So now to the risks. And I think these risks are fairly significant. There's risks of collusion. So if we're sharing data from company to company, and that's not shared with everybody, that is collusion, and you'll go to jail for it. So we need to be really, really careful about doing that. And I'm sort of been talking to lawyers and getting some legal advice on what's allowable and what's not allowable. If we start to change the scoring mechanisms as well, so if you do it amid competition, that's obviously not allowed. If you do it in advance of the competition, then what's the implications of that? I think we need to think through that. What's the implications of using legacy data as well? So if you now start to say, right, I've got some scores from previous bid on health and safety and BIM, and I'm going to use that again on this bid, then what's the implications of reusing some of those scores? And there's a perception of blacklisting as well. So if you've got a load of information on people, there's a perception that you're going to use that for the wrong reasons. So if you start to collect this data, you start to use these sort of capabilities, you really need to understand what the scope is of your use case for using it. If you use it for the wrong reasons, you will go to jail. Procurement risks, I've got a few slides on this actually, so I'll touch on that in a minute. And in terms of data volumes as well, so I'd just like to point out that this doesn't work very well with very, very small data volumes. If you're building one school every blue moon in the Hebrides, it's not going to work. If you're doing it and you're putting a rail track down time after time after time, you've got lots of data on it, and it works really, really well. In terms of the results as well, you've got to be careful because there's bias in the previous results. So it's biased against modular construction, for instance, because modular construction has not been in the previous results. So you need to take account of that. Some of these suppliers have gone, like Carillion is not in there anymore, and some strategies will change as well. So there could be a market entrant, or there could be somebody who's pulling out of a certain sector. So you need to be careful about using all of that data without putting some intelligent insight over the top. What we're also looking at in terms of these scenarios is collapse scenarios. So we could collapse competition. These dominant suppliers double down because they've now got the data and they can really start to drive things forward. If you can now start to understand underbidding as well, you can start to understand nugatory bid costs, you can collapse competition. You can also start to get competition to thrive because it's less of a lottery, you've got more transparency, it's a reduction in bidders, but we get close of clustering, and we can start to shape that scoring as well. And we can also transform it. So a third scenario is we can start to transform it. And I think if we can start to look at some of these factors one by one, we can really drive some transformational change that's positive for clients and suppliers and the entire sector. So in terms of impact on procurement professionals, I think we need to get a greater understanding of stats and data science. All this transparency drives accountability. It gives us this outside view. We can identify variance and bias, scenario analysis. I think we should embrace that, not push it away. I think this is really disruptive. So we need to start to understand emerging case law, which will start to come out. And we need to look at the requirements as well and the scoring where we can encourage competition. And if it's not a real competition, you've got 20 people bidding for it, and it's costing society a lot of money to do that. So what can we do differently? And there's a potential as well for increased automation. We can take this a lot further. So what's the overarching picture? It's, for me, is about the civil service code as well. I get a lot of people in the public sector who's very anti this because they think, well, it means we've got more challenges and stuff. If you read your civil service code, this is what it's all about. It's about integrity, impartiality, it's ignoring inconvenient facts and things like that. If you're unjustifiably favouring one party against another one, it's all about your civil service code. So what we're talking about aligns fully with advanced data analytics. The problem is at the moment we're putting a lot of this into freedom of information requests, and it's really hard. So we can now start to look at these concepts of data trusts. And data trusts, we're cracking on at pace with data trusts at the moment. I'm working with the Oil and Gas Technology Centre and the Oil and Gas Authority to set one up in the oil and gas sector, and that's a regulator, and that's to share project management procurement data. And we're also about to do something very similar with Sir Robert McAlpine in the construction sector as well. So if we can do this with bid data and the bid analytics that goes with it, and manage that by the trustees and make sure that we're using it for the right reasons, we can put a safe environment in place. This is not about sharing data, it's about securely pooling data against specific use cases. We can then start to really drive this forward and get a wealth of insights out of it. We can transform procurement. So in summary, people say to me, this is all pie in the sky, we can't do it. We can do it, it's all possible today. People are starting to use it, they start to engage in it. So what do we do to shape it? And once we start to shape it, that's influencing for both parties. It's going to lead to a lot more challenges in terms of public procurement decisions, but that'll settle out in due course. I think some of those legal issues and those risks I went through are a grey area that probably needs to be bottomed out. And it's going to transform public procurement. I think all procurement, and people say to me, so what does the future look like? And I say, I can't predict what that future looks like because it's emergent. What we need to do is work as a community to engage with it and to react accordingly and make sure that we do it safely and we do it with respect and we do it anticipating the potential use of some of these tool sets as well. So John, that's the main talk completed. So
Okay.
can I pass back to you?
In terms of this, first of all, as the screen suggests, we're using Mentimeter. I put that thing up there. There are loads of questions on there. Either go to mentimeter.com or download the app and answer the questions. So that's another reminder, especially now that Martin has given his overview. Questions are starting to come in. One from Philip, and he says, how how much of the scoring variance you put down to the competence of the buyers, and how much do you put down to the level of training they're given to know how to evaluate bids, e.g. how often this task is delegated to a project sponsor who has not done it before?
Once we start to drill into this data, and this is very top level data at the moment from what you've seen, once we start to drill into it, we can start to get that understanding. So I've funded most of this work as a minimum viable product just to get a conversation going, right? And to say, is this what we want to do? Now, if we do want to do it, then let's work together to start to answer some of these questions and say, what is this telling us? What is this telling us about competence? Where do we need more training? And if there's one authority who's scoring completely differently to other authorities, then an intervention is probably required, because it then becomes more of a lottery if you're bidding into it. And I think that if you are spending £200,000 on a bid, you need to understand your probability of win. You know, in broad terms, it's not going to be exact because it's a probability, but is you need to know, are you in the race or are you a donkey who's in the back of the horse race? You know, that's where you need to start to understand. So I think it's an emergent process, John.
Okay. Got another one from Merv. Says, have you looked at the relationships between successful bids, bidders, and actual contract performance, e.g. association with successful project delivery? And I'd like to add in another one into that, in that, have you looked at how, at the point of selection, you can't use past performance in public procurement, but you can at PQQ stage, as in to get on that final bid list. What are the legal issues there? So first of all, Merv's question, have you looked at the relationship between successful bidders and actual contract performance?
And the answer is not yet, but in terms of that data set, there's a lot of that data in the public domain. So there's things like the major projects reports from the Infrastructure Projects Authority, so we can start to get it from there. And you can also put freedom of information requests in. And there's some frameworks as well where they publish those results. All it needs to do is to go into something like a graph database, and you can correlate the two and get the analytics out of it. So it's possible. It's just the willpower to make it happen and the effort involved in that. So I think that's definitely possible, Merv. I think we can do that. It's just a case of when. And I think as well, if we want to do this as a community, then let's get a backlog of all these things that we want to do. So this is like an agile process. So we've got this minimum viable product. What do we do now to build it out? So we can all start to engage in it and start to have these conversations and transform procurement. What's the second question, John?
Second question was, what would be the legal issues in using all this hard data at PQQ stage to say, well, you've answered the question at something along the lines, and it's very ill-formed. You've answered the questions and they look good, but actually when we look at your data, you've delivered poorly, or the other way around for that matter.
So I'm not a lawyer, John, and I think that your SIG probably understands that a lot better than I do, but I just think that this capability is going to test the law in various situations, and I think we just need to examine each and every component of it. And we can't go into this blind and just do it recklessly. We really need to think it through. I think it needs some working groups on it and try and work through what the implications are.
Yeah, okay, so the answer is I don't know, but I know it matters, something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is from Katrina, does your model learn from its mistakes and correct accordingly over time to improve its rules and accuracy?
Yeah, so it's a full machine learning model at the back of this. So that slide, which I presented before with Network Rail on it, and I think it was North East Council on there, etc. That's learning all the time. So every time it gets some information in and it gets it right or wrong in terms of the bid forecast, it's always learning from it. And that's just using standard machine learning algorithms.
Okay, we've got a question from Samuel. He's having a hard time seeing how this applies to the private sector where freedom of information is not clearly available. What's your views on that?
So for me, it's the same challenge, I think. So I can get this data at the moment from the public sector because I've got a tool to do it. But if you do it with the private sector, if you're putting in a bid and it's costing you hundreds of thousands of pounds to do it, I believe that we should be having a conversation with clients to say, hey, can you give me some feedback on that, and can we openly share it? If we can openly share it, then let's start to learn from it so we get better bids in the future. If you start to get lots of people competing on stuff and their bids are not that great, it's costing you effort to assess those bids, and it's not a real competition because they're an outlier and they're never going to win it. And it's costing them a lot of money because they're working on false hopes and false promises. So I think once we start to do this, if we start off in the public sector and we demonstrate we can do it maturely and not in some sort of confrontational type approach, I think we'll get there. So I think this is a cultural change, and I think this transformation will shape that cultural change.
Okay, this next question leads on from that, and it's from Jason. And he says, I understand the perception of collusion is important and you need to address this. How does collusion interact with data trust if data trusts are only signed up to by a select few organisations?
So the concept of a data trust, right, it's really, really important to understand this. If you Google Open Data Institute and data trust, they published some reports on this about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I've been building off the back of those. So what they're saying is, with a data trust, it needs to be independently stewarded. So if you put your data in, you can't just go and look at other people's data, right? So the steward would look at the risks associated with releasing that data to another data provider or to a third party. And this data steward basically would go back to the trustees and say one of three things. I can use this data, it's fairly low risk. I don't want to use this data because of GDPR risks or there's collusion risks, or it's debatable. If it's debatable, it goes back to the trustees, and the trustees are representatives of those data providers, right? So those data providers would say, in this case, we've done a risk assessment and we believe this is borderline collusion, where they need to take some legal advice on it, or we don't provide it. So it's not a matter of the fact that if you're in the club, you get some privileged data. What we're trying to say is everybody can access that data in theory if they've got an appropriate use case to do so. What we do, for instance, is to give that data to a third-party organisation. It might be an innovator who's coming out and saying, if I can process all of that data, I can give you insights now on the best way of getting bid performance up by 10% for everybody. And if somebody's got an algorithm to do that, then that's great, and that works for bidders and it works for clients as well. So it starts to facilitate all of that innovation.
Right. Okay. My last question, which is just a very simple yes or no, Martin, it is presumably the steward of those data trusts cleans up data, etc., and makes decisions on that.
Yes, within constraints.
Okay, right.
So what we've got at the moment is we're trying to drive forward this agenda about project data analysis and its transformational capability. So we're trying to pull together project management people, portfolio and program management people, and that might be project managers, it might be procurement professionals, bidders, whatever. And we're trying to put them in the same room as data analytics people, data science. It's free to join, it's a free community to attend, and it's a magic source by bringing those organizations together. In 2 months' time, we've got this thing called Project Hack, and what we're trying to do there, we get about 100 people in the room, and it's at the Microsoft Reactor in London. And we try and give people some hands-on experience of working with project data analytics and start to explore some use cases with some real data. And if you've got data and you'd like to come along, and you'd like to present some challenges, then please get in touch with me and we'll try and make that work. But this is a really transformational capability, and I think it's in a lot of people's interest to start to understand it and start to understand its performance capabilities. And we've got these national events. So in terms of London meetup, it was founded back in December 2017, and it's now over 2,600 members. The Bristol event's just taken off recently, and the Manchester event's just taken off recently as well. But I think we're just about to pass, overall, we're just about to pass 3,000 members, which is a great achievement. And what we're trying to do is to get this critical mass where we all start to talk about data, we start to pool this data in data trusts, it then gives us all the capability to really shape the future of project delivery. And it's really transformational. A lot of people's jobs are going to change as a consequence of this. And if you want to get in touch with me, then there's my LinkedIn. And if you want to sort of find out about the project data analytics community, then there's a LinkedIn QR code there as well, and that posts on events. And if we find something interesting as well, then we post through LinkedIn as well. So it keeps you plugged in with what's going on in the community.
Now, back to Mentimeter, please. You can see that majority are from the private sector. We've got a lot more people, or about double that, actually listening into the webinar. Still only one from the third or the voluntary sector. Hello. We can see where the people have come from, the sectors. Most of them are civil engineering, construction, or other, which obviously I need to refine get some AI feedback, although the sample set's not big enough on what those others are. And we can have a look at what people do. And again, most of them are others, just over a third. 30% hands-on project managers, only 4% procurement, and 7% commercial, and only 9% actually involved in bids, which I think this is coming to bids near you, so that needs to be got up. Most people are on the buyer side, 62%, almost 2/3. And then when we start to look at questions, the reactions, we've got, so provoking. Oh, there's one over there, which is a little bit negative. Most of them are positive, though, it has to be said, as we're going down these. I think that this one over there, there's been a lot of debate. I've enjoyed seeing how it can be used. I think Martin's presentation has brought that alive to the potential of it. This one here, a real negative risk of corruption and legal challenge. And it goes back to our reasons for running this. I think it's going to happen in some form or the other. You can either decide not to do it, or if you are going to do it or explore it, you've got to absolutely do it with your eyes wide open. So if we now look at some of this stuff, this is having heard the presentation, people feel that most people feel they can give some form of an informed opinion. Some people, about a third, say I'm still processing it, more reflective people, and others, I don't understand it. Most people, or 40%, think we should help to shape it, and a few think we should actively try and block it, and some should just keep a passive eye on it. And the impact, I'm surprised personally. Most people think that it will be quite significant to transformational. Now that implies that actually most people think that in some ways it will happen. And the logical conclusion is that if in some way it is going to happen, then you need to shape it and take part in some way. In there, 42% want to act no more, while 35% want to actively get involved. And any unresolved issues, well, you can see this. So in this chart, the size of the words indicates how many people have mentioned the word, if you like. So from that we can see, and it's evolving as people add it. So from that we can see that legal and data and legality issues and legal issues and legality are in there, are the big ones. And the other one which stands out a little bit is ethics, and I think that relates to the data trusts and the use of those. So as well as in an ideal world, data or legality follows ethics, then we need to sort out the ethics first before we do look at the legality of it. And obviously in the real world, it's evolving. So in terms of the last one, I think the challenges are showstoppers. So 5% think they're showstoppers. The majority, not by much, think that they're significant but surmountable. And 45% think they're all part and parcel of a major initiative and manageable. 39% think that benefits outweigh the downside. So which implies that, well, I won't say it implies that
I think it's 3.8 out of 5, John.
Right, okay. But there might well be some people in the middle as well. And in terms of that last one, the concept of the data trust I think it's generally majority of, well, 37% are take that it's something which will resolve some of the concerns, but at the same time, people think that it's going to take a long time to mobilise. And let's look down there, almost 1.9% think that it's not going to, it's something that won't work. So closeouts, your thoughts, your summaries. I think that my summary is of Martin's presentation. Is that I can now, both at a project level and bidding, have a much better idea of how it would work. I think that there is some real good potential both on the procurement side and on the bidding side to transform, might be a strong word, but tweak is definitely an understatement, significantly modify personally how people go about procuring, and especially in the supply side, deciding to bid. But I think that there are legal issues which need to be worked through and possibly challenged. So with that, a reminder to draw your event notice to 2 forthcoming events. One is our next webinar, which is on the 30th of May, which is lessons learned from the Carillion collapse part 3, so our third. We've done one which are available on the YouTube channel about assessing suppliers so that you don't select a supplier who is in financial issues. We've done one on how to protect yourself through the contract, although by the time you sign the contract and the contractor's looking insolvent, it's a reactive, if you like, you're minimizing the impact of the risk rather than the likelihood. And this one is by Alistair, who's a mega project manager, and he was managing some projects internationally where 2 of his suppliers started the descent into insolvency. So what are the actual signs on the ground? How do you manage that process as they are in the downward death spiral? And to some extent, how do you actually manage it when they do actually become insolvent and cease to exist? There's also a traditional one, procurement for benefits and value workshop. So the challenge there is I'm doing a project because I want benefits and value from it. I want a supplier who does that, but actually often what they deliver, the tangibles, are a bit remote, or there's others involved in actually delivering the benefit and value and outside their control. So how do you select people? How do you contract on that basis? It's a sort of workshop-y approach, and having looked on the website this morning, it's actually full. So with that, I'd like to say a big thank you to Martin and others. I'll say the others first of all. David Worley, who's done a lot of the back-end stuff, which you haven't seen, and enabled this webinar to work efficiently, particularly with Mentimeter. And of course, you for participating, and above all, Martin for actually contributing. So with that, thank you very much. Goodbye.